Hey, how's it going? So, I had someone ask me recently, what's the difference between RAG and training when it comes to AI? And for context, basically she was running a online store that was selling fashion, not fashion. It was selling like I think sportswear. And what she wanted to do was basically set up an AI chatbot to work for Q&A and to help answer support questions. So the core of it was that she was doing really well and kind of taking off, which was awesome. But she started getting more and more questions from the people buying her stuff. So people wanted to know, like, can I buy this? Or, how do I return this one object? Or when will the shipment come in? And a lot of that stuff you could basically find either internally or you could, sort of track it down on the FAQ and then reply to people. So what she was doing was spending a lot of time just writing emails, right? She was taking in some of these questions, looking at her own website, or just, knowing what was going on, and then eventually replying. So what she wanted to do was basically get an AI to replace her in this process. But she was curious. She basically wondered, like, okay, how do I train an AI on all my stuff? Like, how do I get it to understand what my special sportswear has next month? And she was evaluating a bunch of different tools and basically didn't know what to spend money on. So what I ended up telling her was this analogy. Basically, there's two ways to think about it if I want to have an AI that can answer questions. One of them is RAG, and this stands for Retrieval Augmented Generation. See if I can spell this right. Oops. Retrieval Augmented Generation. This sounds really complicated, and there are some pretty cool aspects of how this works, but a really simple way to think about it is that if someone asks me a question, right, I need to retrieve some information and then generate an answer. So normally if AI exists in, a vacuum, you end up with stuff called like hallucinations where it's just making stuff up. When you have a knowledge base to work with, right, I can actually reach out to that knowledge base and get information and then use that to have a better answer. So if someone says, hey, how's my shipment doing on my new sports hoodie? Instead of just making something up, I can actually check my knowledge base and then return information about that. So that's one way to answer questions if you're trying to build like an automated Q&A or customer support system. The other way is training. And I'm really oversimplifying here. There's a lot of things you can do, but these are like the big two paradigms that people usually encounter. So training can mean a lot of different things. In this particular case, what you can imagine it being like is if I have a person, right, and I want to make them very skilled at a specific subject, I could, send them off to do a PhD at some great university. So for this example, like if I want my robot to be really good at answering questions about my brand, I can basically give it a huge amount of knowledge, right? And then over time, it can actually respond in ways that are fundamentally different. So in the example above, like this person or this AI, it's not really changing. It just has access to different information. When you train an AI, you're like fundamentally changing the way it works, or at least the way it answers questions. Now, what's the main difference between these two? The biggest one that most people care about is that this is way more expensive, or it's usually more expensive, right? There are some cases where it can work quite well, like if I'm only using it to do really specific tasks and I want it to respond in a certain way. You can actually get it to like save tokens, because if you think it for this, like in this example, I have to spend a lot more time reading stuff, and that will cost money, right? So the AI having to absorb more information, it costs more money when you use it. This other example is that once I've done all the learning from my university, I already know it, right? I can just kind of say it off the top of my head. But this actually isn't ideal either, because what it means is that if there's brand new information or if things change, I don't actually know it, right? So I might need to learn all this stuff, but if there's a new line of t-shirts that comes out, I don't actually understand that because I was trained before that happened. So that's something to think about. Another thing is that this also takes way longer. So this is supposed to be a clock. Actually, you know what? Not a clock. It's an hourglass. There we go. So conceptually, you can imagine that if I have to provide my robot with really specific training information, it actually literally goes through like iterations where it's trying to, it's almost like rewiring its brain to respond differently. Whereas in the example above, you don't have to do any of that, right? You can just say, hey, robot, here's a knowledge base, look at it to answer your question. So basically what matters here is that this is almost always the better solution. If you want it to reply in a really specific style, sometimes this makes sense. There's other like niche cases where you actually really do want training. Like there's one project I worked on a while ago where we were going to use the same cheap AI model to answer questions like thousands of times a day. And basically we wanted to reduce the amount of information we had to provide it to answer that question properly. And it was a very simple question. It was basically a classifier. And in that case, I actually did like do basically a fine-tuning training of that model. And the result is that we saved a lot of money, but that was like really niche. Like most of the time you don't need that. So in this example, the way to solve this problem is that you have your robot, and on your website, you have some kind of a knowledge base that basically has a list of all your products. It might have an FAQ. You might even want to hook it up to like your shipping information, right? So in your shipping backend, you can have that as well. And then basically if someone asks a new question, right, they say, hey, like, do you guys sell this kind of t-shirt or this brand of whatever? This AI can immediately reach over here to the knowledge base, use that to give an answer, and then your customer is happy. And this is great because if you get this working once, this can talk to everybody. It can also talk to everyone in different languages, which is really exciting. So in her case, right now she's thinking about, she mainly has people in the US buying, but there's a lot of people in Mexico that also, you know, are curious about what she's doing. And she wanted to have this, like the exact same customer support system. And she could literally just have it like exactly the same. Even like she didn't even have to change her backend. And it was just, you know, respond in Spanish. And that was it. So pretty incredible. And, you know, if she had gone with kind of a training example, like she was considering to do, the way that she was looking at designing it as a language model would not have worked out. So basically, go for RAG 99% of the time. If you just want something that does Q&A, that is the correct system. Cool. At some point, I'll make like a more technical video of it. 3 Blue, 1 Brown probably has a really good one, but as far as you need to know for like high level actual implementation, that's what matters. Use RAG. It's really good. Thanks.